Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the last day of Access U. I'm Marquis. I'm going to be like the Zoom coordinator for today, and your speaker is going to be Josh Hedrick. And the topic for today is exploratory design using exploratory testing principles to create accessible designs. This mic is going to be, if you have any questions or comments, please raise your hand so that the people on Zoom can hear. That's what this mic is for. And if anyone in the Zoom has any audio issues, please just put it in the chat. And if anyone in the Zoom has a question or a comment, raise your hand on the Zoom and we'll get you unmuted. All right, and then I'll hand it over.
Okay, great, thanks.
Oh, sorry.
Yes.
One more thing. I'm going to also pass around this sign-in sheet. So I don't have a pen though. So if anyone has a pen, thank you.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks for being here. I know it's first thing in the morning on day 3, and our brains are probably all full already. So, as much as with the barbecue event the other night, like thanks for squeezing in a little bit more. So I'm just going to give a quick overview of what I'm going to be talking about, and then I'll dive in, give a little introduction to myself and everything. After just a little bit of kind of explanatory stuff at the top, I'm going to talk in a bit kind of about me and where my path, how it kind of ended up here, and why I kind of talk about both QA and UX. Then I'm going to give a little background on kind of what exploratory testing is. I think it's a thing that a lot of us do. It's just kind of the name for it, and kind of has a certain approach to it. And then I'll spend some time on some specific like questions and strategies that I use to as a starting point for that kind of exploration and iteration. And then we can wrap it up and take questions. We can also just do questions as we go. If you have anything in the moment, just feel free to do that. But there will definitely be some time at the end if we need it. And these slides that I'm showing on screen are available. They were available in Zoom, but the link to them, the short link would be joshuahetrick.info/accessu2025. That'll redirect to this GitHub page's URL. And if you want to put them on your own device for whatever reason, just save them for later. You can grab a zip file of them from GitHub. And it has a Creative Commons license, so you're free to share this, whatever you want. Just have to attribute for non-commercial purposes. And if you do something like change it, extend it in some way, then you just have to share it under the same terms. But the information is meant to be shared. And so about myself and kind of how I ended up doing what I'm doing. My name is Josh, as we said. He, him. I'm about 6 feet tall, white guy, scruffy brown hair. If you met me in the winter, I had a beard, so I make it hard. But right now, I just have a perpetual 5 o'clock shadow. And I'm wearing a shirt for the Portland Mercury, which is a local independent news outlet where I live in Portland, Oregon. And it has some cartoons of bikes on it because when I'm not excitedly talking about accessibility, I'm excitedly talking about bikes and transportation. So if either of those things are of interest to you, always come talk to me. But I'm sharing a few things today that I think are useful and I've found helpful in my own practice and on my teams I've worked on. But I'm definitely interested in feedback, clarifications, corrections, additions, etc. So definitely give me your thoughts if you think I missed something or if you have something to add to it. So my path into technology started in the late 1900s, as it were. The mid 1990s, to be specific. I mostly just got started doing little hand-rolled web pages on GeoCities and the like about whatever interested me at the time. And not really important for this talk, but if you ever want to talk about Lookout Records punk bands or the show Syphil and Ollie, all would love to. But that experience for me was really kind of formative because it gave me this kind of early the HTML first mindset. The fact that CSS and JavaScript weren't really things yet probably helped with that, but it still gave me this idea that the web was something that was participatory and personal, and is meant to be, it was open to some random 14-year-old in a one-stop-light town. So, why shouldn't it be available to everyone? Professionally, I've been doing this for about 20 years in various forms. I started doing tech support, and then I started doing QA, and kind of long arc into design and accessibility. And that path through QA is really, it was really formative for kind of how I ended up on this topic. I had some moments where I realized I was trying to test some particular feature or another, and I was just struggling so much to test it and to write documentation for it and so forth. And this light bulb went off, like, what if maybe this product just isn't very good? Like, what if it just worked better? What if we designed it better in the first place instead of trying to test out the problems? And so that really got me on my kind of path towards design. But I retained a lot of the thinking as far as the kind of quality mindset. I know if anyone here has worked in QA formally or any sort of testing, accessibility or otherwise, you know that you usually get brought in kind of later in the process than you'd like to be, and it's like almost always brought in too late. But some of the most effective work I felt like I did when I was in QA was testing early on, when we were advising the teams, we were helping shape the product requirements, we were giving them early sort of, hey, what if this happens? These kind of more conceptual things. It wasn't about writing test cases and saying, do this, here's the bug, file it this way. It was about understanding what the needs of it were. And it was kind of a quasi-design skill set. And that's ultimately I decided to move fully into design, but I think QA at its best can kind of function as that sort of dual role. But it really helped me think about quality as something, as an aspect of the project, not just like a job role. So I've kind of carried that with me and use my quality skills that I've learned as kind of co-designing tools. And I think one of the techniques that bridges sort of QA and UX and that sort of mindset the best, in my experience, has been this idea of exploratory testing, which is it's this idea that you're kind of simultaneously learning and testing and adapting to information as you encounter it, as opposed to, say, just coming in saying, here's a big list of tests, I'm going to run them all, and whichever ones fail, they fail, whichever ones pass, they pass, and kind of throwing it over the wall. It's a little bit more of a, you come in with a sort of initial thought or approach. You might be given a mandate from someone else, like a product owner or something, or you might be sort of more self-directed. And it lets you say, okay, I'm going to start exploring different aspects of the system. And as you're learning, as you get results, that's going to modify, where do you go next? What do you look for? What sort of information does that tell you about how the rest of the system works? And so it's kind of a combination of, I think in some cases, some people have also just called it ad hoc testing, but there was a feeling that didn't really capture the real sentiment of it. Ad hoc sounds kind of random and just throwing things around and maybe undirected. And this is more of a intentional sort of, and more of an intentional exercise to sort of start in a particular point and just use that as your lens for understanding where you go next. And I think in terms of accessibility, I think it's a really good match because in addition to sort of your technical knowledge and what you're finding out about the product, it really relies on it leverages your own professional and lived experience. So you can say things like, oh, I've encountered this sort of a modal or whatever it is on this page. And as someone who might be a keyboard only user or anything else, you might say, I know the sorts of things to look for here. I'm going to lean into those rather than necessarily go through this formal list of tests. Like I'm going to look for the errors that I know I've found in the past. And so I think it's a great way to leverage that kind of specific personal knowledge. And so maybe just like as an example, if you were to say maybe have something like a search page, a homepage of a product, and there's a search bar on the top, you might say, oh, we need, a product owner tells you, we need to test the search functionality. And so one traditional approach might be to go in and kind of look at all the different technical requirements and write out a lot of tests and do the API documentation and such. And that's important. And I think there's a good need for that, but it's also, for the sort of exploratory approach, you'd probably say like, well, what sorts of things are we going to do with this search page? Like what happens when there are lots of results, when there are no results, when I misspell something slightly, when I, tab in there, but then I click on the search button, or, I zoom the page and do all these kind of different things that it forces you out of this sort of more like if this then that sort of mentality, and really gets you thinking about just like the myriad of possibilities that could possibly happen. I feel like it matches the real world experience of users don't sit down and run test cases. They use your website. They do all sorts of things. They get interrupted. They come back to it. They paste in the wrong text and all that kind of stuff that I think lends itself well to the sort of exploratory process. And for when you get now sort of thinking as a tool for doing this while you're designing, to me is particularly helpful because you can take that information instead of, say, if you have a built site and you're testing it, and then you might use this exploratory process to like eventually come up with the tests that you do want to be repeatable. But in the design context, you can say, I'm just going to modify the design so it does the things, so I just avoid the failure cases altogether. Like I just sidestep the eventual bug by just, having it cease to be in the first place. And so it can be like a nice process to step through as you're designing. And because something like prototype it's not really testable with AT the way that, something like a web page might be. So especially if you're using something that's not kind of finished code, you're going to have to be a little creative with the way you test it because you can't really use the true AT to find out what the exact results are. So I think being able to kind of imagine this process and then modify as you go is a great way to kind of help paper over some of those shortcomings. Some of these tools, like Figma, made a few nascent attempts to make prototypes keyboard navigable, but they're still very limited. And then we saw things like this week, Figma sites launched, and they have real web pages, and they're still not navigable. Like there will still be a need for this sort of approach where you're really thinking about things when you're still, you could do this when it's on paper still. It doesn't even have to be digital, or just kind of ideation level. And so one of the main ideas of exploratory testing is you have this kind of what they tend to call a charter, where you like choose an area that you're going to focus on. And that could be any number of things. It could be really open-ended, it could be really specific. But the point is you pick a certain starting point and then you kind of build your exploration from there. And I think a lot of us have done things like that, especially if you run something like Axe on a web page and you get the errors. Now that's your starting point. You're going to start exploring from there. You're like, oh, here's a bunch of errors about headings. Here's a bunch of errors about lists or whatever other thing. And so it gives you a great starting point, and then you kind of start pulling threads from there. The things I'm going to talk about here in just a second are the kind of ones that I've landed on personally as useful starting points. So I have these 5 questions that I use, and I use these as sort of the kind of abstract questions about the design. And I find that helpful at this design phase because it's not tied to specific technologies, specific tasks. It's really more about kind of reflecting on the purpose of the design or the need of the design, and then iterating from there. And then I also have kind of 4 test methods, which do get into kind of the specifics, kind of thinking about things like, keyboard navigation or using a screen reader. And they're especially helpful when you're kind of combine them with all the other things. You start thinking about these kind of high-level questions, and then once you start weaving through different possibilities, then you start saying, okay, well, what would it really be like if someone does this like specific type of interaction? And it helps you kind of get right down to like the nuts and bolts of the specific code you might need. But I think one of the big takeaways from this is that it's meant to be adaptable. These are just the ones that I'm sharing as my good starting points, and I think they're helpful, but it's more about the overall process or thinking behind it rather than any specific question or sort of starting point. And so the 5 questions that I kind of landed on that I found really helpful, and I've used these for like web and for mobile, and you kind of use for whatever you want, are just pretty high level questions about like a design or a page. And it's number 1 is like the outline of the page. 2 is what actions are possible. 3 is what states are possible. 4 is where can you go from this page, and 5 is what kind of static content is on the page. And for each one of these, I'll talk just a little bit about them and give an example of sort of where it ties to maybe more specific criteria, and that you would probably start digging in on those. And so just as a quick sort of a foil for this exercise, I have a Figma mockup here of a very basic login screen. It's a like mobile formatted portrait, has a header with a site menu, something like a hamburger menu, a footer with some copyright, and then the main section of the page is just your kind of classic. There's a logo, there's a heading, there's an email, a password, a tick box to show or hide the password, a link to reset the password, and then a login button. And so this is just reflective of a general idea of login. It might be extremely early in the process. A lot of logins have other things, or they're integrated into a bigger site, but this is just kind of a basic example of something, so I can kind of talk through this a little bit. And so for kind of going through each one of these questions is the first one is like, what's the outline of the page? And I usually approach this first. Like these kind of I don't know they necessarily go like broadest to more specific, but there's a little bit of an arc in that direction. Kind of trying to look at like just high level like structure of the page, and then maybe getting into some more specific stuff as I go. So it's really just thinking about the big form of the page overall. What would the table of contents be if you were making a table of contents for this page? Or if you only had a sentence or two to describe it, like what's the purpose of the page? What should it look like? And I find this to be really helpful for kind of front loading the purpose and the structure and the hierarchy. Sometimes you have projects that when you say this and then you look at the eventual result, or you look at maybe say an early design prototype, you go, oh, we're weighting all the things wrong. If the most important thing here is logging in, we shouldn't have the premium sign up thing or whatever be above that. Like, it shouldn't be like, if that's truly what's most important on the page, that's what, the outline should reflect that. And so it sort of forces you to be honest about some of the choices you're going to make for how you can group things and so forth. So, and that ties into things like groupings and headings, landmarks and regions, and to some extent, keyboard navigation makes you think about the order, how much of it there is. If the important thing is halfway down the page and there's a lot of stuff to get through, is that acceptable? And just starting to choose things with good semantics. That's kind of a perennial bullet point. Just every one of these, it's like choose good semantics, because that kind of underpins all your choices. But so in the case of this, this is a pretty simple page, so we don't have a lot of choices to make here. But if you were starting to go through this, you might talk about like, okay, well, this looks like a heading, but like, does our team know that needs to be marked as a header, that this needs to be a nav element or whatever? Is there a main? Do we need a skip link to get to the middle? Does this page exist kind of in isolation, or what's the rest of the navigation look like? And it just forces you to sort of start thinking about how all the pieces are connected. In this case, it's a relatively straightforward example, so we wouldn't have a ton of decisions to make here, but most pages have a little more going on than this. And so for me, I think the next like two questions are the ones that really end up ferreting out kind of the most interesting feedback, especially when you start getting into more complex pages. But so we talk about like which actions are possible on a page. And so this is like any kind of interaction, whether it's like a text field or a button, and also things that might be able to change like the perceived state of the page without actually changing any data. So it'd be something like filtering a table, or sorting a table, expanding and collapsing things. And it forces you to think about something like, say, that top navigation. How exactly does that expand? Is that what mechanism do you want to use for that? What happens when you hit reset password? Sometimes that opens in a new tab. Like if it does, then okay, now I should warn about that. Okay, do I need an icon? And it's sort of, that's where that exploratory kind of mindset comes in, where you make one decision and you say, okay, now that I made this decision, what does that imply? What does that imply? What does that imply? It's kind of the 5 whys in reverse. And so for actions, I think one of the big ones is buttons versus links, especially if you have a menu of items and some of them are actually actions, some of them are navigation. Thinking about how to manage that so you can meet expectations correctly. And thinking about things like if you have a text field, what kind of text input is it? It's easy. A lot of times in Figma, you're just going to have something like a component for a text field, you drop it in, you move on. But it's like, okay, if this is an email field, we need to make sure that our team knows that there should be the email address specific keyboard should come up when you type, with the whichever attribute that is, I forget offhand. And things like the show password checkbox. I put it as a checkbox here, but a lot of times you have that little button in the field, and then that sort of begs questions of, okay, well, should I put it in the field? How is that going to be keyboard navigable? Is the icon have enough contrast? Do we use that eyeball? I don't really like the eyeball. Everybody uses the eyeball. Should we just use the eyeball anyway? And it just kind of like goes from there and lets you talk through all those, and if it helps you kind of rationalize those decisions. And I also find it really helpful to, as I'm going through this, capturing some of that rationale as I go. And that's useful for like reviewing with product owners or other team members. We have like a design crit type thing. So that way, even if you ultimately end up making a different decision, you at least have you kind of know how and why you arrived at this decision. Because sometimes it can be hard to remember why you made every decision. So this process of kind of like, well, I came here wondering this, and then I chose this, and kind of keep layering on. And I think the third question, like which states are possible. For me, this is the one where the QA brain really kind of serves me well. And it's thinking about all the different types of states, which could be things that are anything about the page that is needs to be perceived visually or semantically. So things like fields being required or having an error, any sort of changes in data that could really impact what you're looking at. And a big one I think is temporary states. Like if you get to you sign up for a new account and you're now on some sort of dashboard, there's no content because you're brand new. Like what does that empty state look like? If there's a setup wizard on the first run, what is that going to look like? And I'll kind of save us the trouble of watching me Figma jockey live. But in a real session, if I was doing this kind of quiet work on this fuse, I'd probably be like duplicating this board, adding different ideas, iterating, leaving comments for myself, kind of doing that in the moment as much as I can. The purpose of using these questions is more to just act on them rather than just kind of reflect mostly. But I kind of take that approach of, if you can make the change right now, do it. If you need more than a minute or two to do it, just leave a comment, come back to it later, kind of thing. But for this, I think something like validation and errors is a big part of ferreting out the possibilities before you run into them. That's one thing that I found a lot of designers overlook is like things like error states and the error flow, like what happens when the error happens? Like, does it get announced immediately? Do you have to submit the form to get the error? How is it indicated when you clear the error? Does it immediately clear? All these kind of little micro decisions that do have an impact on how it's going to be announced, in different ways is going to be important here. So I think leaning into this side of it and sort of doing I've heard it called like pre-mortem, like the anticipating problems before they happen, and trying to get ahead of them. And each one of these kind of has different aspects. If you think about some common like patterns of, well, an error state might have an error message beneath the input, and you have an icon, and you have a message like, okay, that's red. Is it, do we have good contrast on that red? Not people don't always choose a good red. Sometimes it's too light. What is the icon we're using? Are we using an icon? If we have help text next to one of these fields, is it distinguishable from the error text that appears beneath it, and so forth. And so just kind of that bouncing back and forth between all those possibilities helps hone it a considerable amount before you kind of get down the road and actually start having to build things. And you could be doing this as you build them as well, especially if you are someone who's kind of designing and coding yourself. But I'm mostly approaching this from the kind of design lens. And for me, so number 4 would be, where can you go from this page? And that's thinking about what are your choices for navigating. Oh, okay, we have a question. Yeah. Yeah. Mhm. Oh, in this case of like a login field, these are probably both required, but like if it was a profile field and you could put your name, email, and then like maybe your location is optional. Yeah. Yeah. But it's also, that was a good point. I meant to talk about that, but it's also, you say like, is it required? Well, like, should it be? Sometimes people say, well, we need to get XYZ from our users. Well, this gives you a chance to reflect and say like, do we actually need this data? Like, is this appropriate even? What kinds of form should we allow it? Is it a short text? Is it long text? Is it a drop down of choices? Like, do we give them an other option? All these sorts of things that like you just kind of critically analyze each chunk of it as you go. And so for navigation, it's thinking about, there's navigation kind of within the page, and then also where does this page fit in a larger context. So something like a login page, you might have been trying to go somewhere else. Like, regardless of what happens on this page, are we able to continue you on to your destination? That's really important because people get really tripped up if you were trying to go to some sort of deep link, get forced to log in, and you get dumped back to a homepage. And so you may not have control over that, technically speaking, but at least it's very good to kind of understand what your expectation is for the flow, and to be ahead of that as much as possible. And this also helps cover things like descriptive link text, the sort of the read more or see more type links. If you were to come through here and say like, where can you go? You might think about like thinking about the context of like a screen reader that might list out all the links just in a list. And you say, okay, well, would this be sufficient for navigating? Is this going to be clear? Are things that are buttons, links, vice versa, making sure those appear in the right context so that when you build this stuff out, you have the right approach. And it also helps you think about maybe the purpose of a page in a larger structure. And if you end up having a lot of, say, maybe there's a lot going on this page, you might end up ultimately deciding this should be 2 pages. This other chunk should be a modal that's a separate process versus being everything and being in line, or whatever it is. The point is just kind of to reflect on it and think about these choices so that ultimately you're getting something that's a lot more usable, and of course accessible. And then the last of these questions is like which static content is on the page. And it doesn't have to be like static, like it could be a username, so it could be different for you or different for the other person or whatever. But the point is it's not dynamic in the context of the page. It's not something that's going to change while you're using the page. And so this helps cover things like alt text and content like plain language content, just how you're using color and contrast and text versus imagery. And if you need to have things like screen reader only content for things like headings that are not visible for some reason or another, or ARIA labels, whatever it is. And this also helps remind you that the certain things like visual content might always get, say, tagged by your team for translation, but if you don't specifically call out, hey, this screen reader only heading isn't going to be visible on the page, but we need to make sure this gets in the translation queue along with the rest of the content. And so some of these things, like they kind of start getting in the weeds, but it's just meant to be a lens to kind of decide like what decisions need to be made. And it's if you have a team that say translation isn't a concern or not an issue because they're good at this part, you can just kind of breeze over that. The point is to kind of invest your effort where it counts the most, because usually we are limited on time, limited on effort. And so each of these aspects, shake out the most important stuff so that way you can get there the fastest. And so kind of in combination with that, so those questions are kind of more high level. They're not specific to any particular technology or usage. Like it could be web, it could be a mobile app, it could be a kiosk, it could be whatever. Like those are all kind of fairly generic, like usable questions. This one is a little more specific. I kind of combined them. It comes at the same concerns, just from a different angle. And so it's my kind of big four things that I test with are colors and contrast, keyboard navigation, zooming and scaling, and using a screen reader. And I will use these too if I'm testing something that's already live. But so if you're testing something that's only in, say, Figma right now, it's going to be a little difficult. You have to kind of imagine how it's going to work. You can say, how would someone navigate if they were hitting the H key for if they were navigating by heading with a screen reader. So it takes a little bit of imagination, and that means it takes some kind of familiarity with the tools. So that's kind of the only reason I mark this as intermediate on the session, is because it does require some familiarity to be able to kind of anticipate how these things are going to work and respond in the context of if you're just looking at something like essentially a wireframe and you're trying to anticipate how someone running a screen reader might interact with it or how voice control might interact with it. I didn't include voice control on my list of kind of big ones. I do tend to include it when I'm doing mobile app testing, say usually in favor of external keyboard navigation. But it's variable. It's kind of whichever things are most important and most likely to ferret out good design choices in your whatever project or whatever you're working on. And the point of these isn't to be extremely exhaustive, especially at the design phase. It's just meant to cover kind of most of the ground most of the time. So that way you can make sure that you're not, when you kind of have those high level questions, if you're thinking maybe a little too big, you might stop thinking about these kind of like, oh, and I really got to think about not only just are there headings, but what if I navigate by heading and that skips past, like maybe you have a design where there's cards of content. Sometimes there's an important image before the heading. So that means if you navigate by heading, you're going to miss that image on the card. And so the point is to say, now that I'm doing this, it's not only just that, yeah, we should have good structure to have good headings, but specifically the interactions for the headings should follow good practices, things like that. So there are definitely things that are not covered by these kind of test methods, but it's meant to be a kind of a relatively tight-knit net, but not perfect. And again, it's something that is kind of meant to be adaptable to to whichever thing is necessary in your project above and beyond. And I also would include probably, if I was on doing native testing, I also tend to include rotation for mobile devices, because that's one that gets overlooked a lot. There was actually a really great, someone shared it's like state of mobile apps, some agency or whoever put it out. It's really good, but they do talk about how the rotation is actually really poorly supported, even amongst apps that otherwise do really well on the accessibility front. And so that's something that at the design phase, if you don't think about it until something is already built, you're probably kind of lost the game already. You're going to have the team say, oh, we can't go back. Oh, sure. Rotation, like for portrait and landscape rotation for on a phone or a tablet or something. Yeah. So yeah, it's something that is not very well supported, especially in the mobile app space. Mobile web a lot more. You have to kind of try to prevent it. But on native mobile, it's still unfortunately not supported super well. So that's something that I think is really important to think about as a concrete exercise. And that is one that really does spur a lot of exploration and discovery, because as soon as you take this board and say, I said I'd save you the Figma jockeying, but we're going to do this and just find out what happens if I change it to, oh no, they've changed so much. Where did they do the thing where you, yeah, all right, never mind. But as soon as you change it from portrait to landscape, usually everything falls apart if you haven't done everything, like set up all your auto layouts really good, set up all your padding and margining, all this kind of stuff. Like you really have to start thinking about like, how does this content adapt, even to the point of, footers need to shrink or headers need to shrink, all kinds of stuff. It really forces a lot of design decisions and a lot of thinking about how should this really be optimized as soon as you make that first choice. So that's kind of the point of this, is like you have that first choice and hopefully it leads somewhere useful, and then you can start making choices on top of that. And I think this kind of ties it together in some way, but the WCAG guidelines, but actually the guidelines, part of the guidelines, we talk about there's the principles and the guidelines and the success criteria. And we spend a lot of our time focusing on the success criteria, but the guidelines themselves actually have some really great content. And they really help contextualize what all the individual success criteria are. And I think it's, when you're at the design phase, something like the 4 principles are really broad and not like particularly actionable. And something like the success criteria is there's so many of them to sort of, you can't hold them all in your head and think about all of them at the same time and test them all at the same time. But something like these guidelines, they're a lot more approachable, and they could sort of, they help you kind of guide your thinking on these matters, even if you're not looking at specific exact success criteria, for example. Because also not everything falls into a success criteria. One of my things that I do always focus on is like forced colors mode or Windows high contrast mode. And that doesn't technically fall under any given criteria, but it does kind of fall under the robustness principle and sort of the adaptability mindset. And so using the guidelines as one of these lenses of like, how do I, what should I, what am I missing from this design? Who might possibly be excluded from this? It forces you to sort of think that through those level without getting in the weeds of sort of maybe the more pass-fail sort of mindset. And you could even just skip everything I just mentioned and just go to the WCAG guidelines and just go straight to those and use them as your sort of lens for, starting points for exploration. I think they're a pretty good starting point. They're a little more numerous than like 5 questions. There's like 13 of the guidelines, so it's a little wordier, but ultimately they're a really good starting point. And then of course, with the idea of exploring is, you would start on one of these guidelines and you'd kind of start honing down and then say, okay, now that I'm talking about specific things like labels, I should dig into the specific label criteria. What's that? 253, label and name. Okay, I got that one, and start making sure that you've got coverage for those specific test cases. This kind of jives with what the folks from the W3C were saying about with the overall direction of where WCAG 3 is likely heading, is that kind of more outcomes-based approach. And yes, having specific testable criteria, but also trying to focus on those outcomes first and foremost. And I just wanted to give a quick shout out to Eric Eggert had a good article about this kind of using the guidelines and the criteria. It's called Guidelines and Guardrails. And I feel like I've seen some other people write some other similar smart things about kind of the guidelines level of the guidelines, but I don't recall who it was or where I found it. So if anyone knows of any good articles on that, please share it. And so really, I think to kind of just tie it all together, the main purpose of this is that exploratory testing is just it's an approach to exploring a system. You learn as you go, you adapt, and you kind of apply the new knowledge. And to be most useful, you probably want to choose you have some sort of structured starting point, but then you kind of let the process kind of unfold as you go. And I think above all else, it's meant to be adaptable. It's the process itself is intended to be used kind of as you see fit. And so I think in this case, that's kind of the best thing to do is, start somewhere, find out what works, find out what doesn't, change it for your team, add hyper-specific criteria for your product you're on or whatever, just in case you need to. There's some sort of common failure point or whatever it is, but the goal is to just use this and adapt it as needed. So we'll do questions in just a second, but I just wanted to give a quick thank you to AccessU for doing AccessU, Knowbility for doing AccessU, and I came to AccessU in 2017 and found it to be super, super helpful, and it really boosted my knowledge and kind of set me in the direction I'm in. And so I'm just really glad to have an opportunity to present and kind of close the loop on that. And I find it to be really really great experience. So I'm glad to be able to be here, and thank you to the AV folks and the catering and everything, because events don't happen without those people too. So yeah, and I have a host of ways to get a hold of me if you're interested. And this is all, again, these are all in the slides. So so yeah, I don't know. Are there questions, comments, reflections? Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I was late, so maybe I missed this, or I'm a UX designer and just don't know, but what do you mean by good semantics?
Oh, it would be things like using, something like a button element instead of a div element with, kind of making it into a button, forcing it into a button. So it basically means like, using tools that have kind of the right meaning behind them. So that way, when someone who's using something like a screen reader, they'll arrive on it and it'll say, announce it as a button, or it'll announce it as a link or whatever. So that way you give the best intention about what your, the actions and things are on the page. And there's not always a perfect fit. That's kind of why ARIA exists. It's also why, people come up with all sorts of clever things, and there's not always an exact line, but the goal is to choose sort of the closest fit, or at least the least incorrect. It's a good choice. Yeah. Okay, cool. Thanks for being here. And if anyone, has questions or anything, you can always find me one of these places, or at a meetup in Portland. We do occasional meetups. Some in person, some online. So if you're not in Portland, feel free to join our online ones as well. So. And actually, we have an event in June, which is a QA/UX. We're collaborating with local QA group. So at Propel. So.